Gentle lady viewers and gentlemen viewers, good evening and welcome to this, our historical sketches show. This episode is the third part of the adventurous flight of Napoleon Bonaparte, as you know, after having been defeated during the last epic battle of Waterloo in June 1815. In episode number 2, we followed Napoleon from Paris to the Atlantic French coast, as you can see on the map, and we left him on the pretty island of Aix. And after some confusion and deliberation, it was decided that Napoleon would give himself up to the English. To this purpose, a boat with negotiators was sent to the British galleon Bellerophon, of which we spoke last time, and which the sailors knew by the more familiar name of Billy Ruffian. When the boat returned from the Bellerophon, the chief negotiators, Mr. Las Casas, was very optimistic about the English, and he advised Napoleon to give himself up and go on board the British ship, as we said, the Bellerophon. At that point, Napoleon started drafting a letter to His Majesty, the Prince Regent, consigning himself into the hands of England. Like Themistocles, he said, the leader of the ancient Greece. The idea was that when Napoleon reached England, his attending general, the brave Gaspard Gourgaud, whom we introduced in the first episode, Napoleon would bring the letter personally to the Prince Regent himself. By the way, the Prince Regent, whom you see in this picture, was in fact regent from 1810 to 1820 before becoming King George IV. He was regent because George III, yes, the same George III associated with the America's War of Independence, King George III had become actually mad. For those who remember the British serial Blackadder, the Prince Regent was mercilessly made fun of and portrayed mostly as dim-witted. And so Napoleon and his small party sailed from the Bellerophon, commanded by a Captain Maitland, but Gourgaud, the faithful Gourgaud, was moved to another ship, a corvette by the name of Slaney, and he writes very accurately in his diary that the Slaney had 4 guns and 8 carronades. And if you want to know what is a carronade, here is a picture. It was a gun for short-range firing, as naval battles were fought by aligning the ships side by side, forming a line. And this is why the galleons, like the Bellerophon, were called ship of the line. When in position, they used the short-range guns, these carronades, to fire big and heavy cannon balls into the hull of the other ship, with deadly consequences, of course, when the cannon ball hit the target. Now, it took from July 15, 1815, to July 23, 1815, for the Bellerophon and for the accompanying fleet to reach England. And here you can see a map of the journey. They skirted Brittany, passing by the island of Seine that you see here, and also by the island of Ouessant, which you also see in this picture, which is the island of Ouessant is the westernmost point of France, just off the Brittany coast. And these are habitually very rough waters. And in fact, in his diary, Gourgaud reports that the pilot of his corvette, the Slaney, lost his way. He thought he was near the island of Ouessant, where in fact he was just south of the other island, the island of Seine. Now, when the Bellerophon carrying Napoleon, and as well as the corvette Slaney that was carrying Gourgaud, and the other ships as well. When they finally reached England, they arrived in Plymouth, as I said, on July 23rd, 1815. Now, Gourgaud expected to be able to land and carries Napoleon's letter called the Themistocles letter to the Prince Regent, but that was not to be. He was denied landing by the captain of the corvette, Gourgaud it is, and now this small fleet of ships moved from Plymouth to Torbay, as you see here on the map, and bid again and back again to Plymouth, where there were a great number of people, all curious to see Napoleon, where they went with their boat to surround the Bellerophon. And in fact, police boats had to be sent out to keep people away. The captain of the Bellerophon, Captain Maitland, now he goes back and forth from the ship to the mainland, and eventually another admiral, Admiral Keith, whose imposing figure you see in this picture, and the Undersecretary of the British State did arrive. They go and see Napoleon on the Bellerophon, and it is Admiral Keith, who informed Napoleon that his final destination was going to be the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Now, some viewers may ask why the British did not execute Napoleon outright, as the Americans did with Saddam Hussein or with Gaddafi, as they have tried to do many times with Fidel Castro for that matter. The point is that with Napoleon, notwithstanding the official political line of the British government of the time, Napoleon had several followers, many followers even in England, and even some of them were even in high places. In fact, the French Revolution had stirred feelings of sympathy, even among the conservative classes. And the poet Wordsworth, famous poet, traveled to France at the onset of the French Revolution and even fell in love at the time in Paris. He says in one of his poems, "O pleasant exercise of hope and joy, bliss was it in the dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meagre, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute look at once the attraction of a country in romance." Perhaps Napoleon hoped to convert himself into a kind of transplanted squire of English squire of French origin, but whatever Napoleon could have been, he would have represented an unwilling magnet of the forces of change. Now, some viewers may recall that the Council of Vienna in 1815 restored back the French monarchy and all the regimes that had been subverted by Napoleon under the influence of the French Revolution. But, as the nursery rhyme says, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. And after the French Revolution, Europe would never be the same, for good or for bad. And England, of course, wanted absolute security from further interventions by Napoleon in his affairs. Now, let's return to Napoleon now, who is still on the Bellerophon outside Plymouth Harbor, and who, as I said, has been informed that he will be taken to the island of St. Helena. Napoleon's reaction at first said that he certainly would not go to any place called St. Helena. By coming to England, he said he had paid the greatest possible compliment to a nation whose present conduct towards him would throw, as he said, a veil of darkness on its history. But Napoleon really had no other option. And now, aboard the Bellerophon, a decision had to be made as to who would accompany Napoleon at St. Helena. There was a General Montlohon with his wife, General Bertrand, also with his wife, General Gourgaud, to whom we owe all this information, and record all the events that happened in the aftermath of Waterloo up to the year 818. And in fact, in the year 818, Gourgaud left St. Helena with the agreement of Napoleon in an attempt to straighten up the affairs as pertaining to Napoleon's family, and in particular the son of Napoleon and of Marie Louise of Austria, Napoleon II, of whom we spoke in the second episode. He died of consumption actually in 1832, so we don't hear much about it. This is why he's lost in history, so to speak. Now, among the characters who accompanied Napoleon to St. Helena, there was an unusual one, was a character by the name of Ali Saint-Denis, and he was a French-born Turkish-Egyptian Mameluke, as it is called. This tribe was the Mamelukes, and he was Napoleon's valet. And in the field, during all the battles of Napoleon, his task was to carry the spyglass of the emperor, the binocular, and a small bottle of brandy. In 1815, he was made a captain, and in St. Helena his task was to take care of all the books and all the dictations of Napoleon. Furthermore, during the captivity in St. Helena, a daughter was born to the Mameluke by the name of Ali, although we have no news about who was the mother or the wife or whatever. But his daughter, a daughter of Napoleon's valet, was still alive in 1898, and on the day of her baptism in St. Helena, Napoleon gave her a gold chain, which this lady who died in 1898 preserved almost as a sacred relic throughout her life. The valet Ali was also part of the entourage, along with Gaspard Gourgaud, when they returned to St. Helena in 1840 to bring back to France the remains of Napoleon. But let's go once more back to Plymouth now in England. A new admiral now comes on board the Bellerophon, and he is the Admiral Cockburn, who communicates to Napoleon that the sea travel to the island of St. Helena will occur not aboard the Bellerophon, but aboard another ship, another man of war that was called the Northumberland. Now, this Admiral Cockburn enables us to establish a historical thread, if you like, between Napoleon and the American War of 1812. The American War of 1812 between England and the United States is not very well known, even among Americans. But it was the first reported instance of, if you like, of America wanting to bring quote-unquote freedom and democracy to another country. In the instance, it was Canada, a country that they wanted to invade and to annex, except that the Canadians did not want to have anything to do with the annexations, and so the forerunner of today's war on terror and great promoter of the annexation of Canada was Henry Clay, to whom a street is dedicated in Portland, as you will know. Among other things, the annexation would have eliminated any restraint on the occupation of Indian lands, and in fact, during the War of 1812, the native Indians fought as allies to the British. Henry claimed that the Canadians the Canadians wanted to be liberated, but instead the Canadians defended pretty well themselves along with the British and, as I said, with the Indians. In fact, the War of 1812 did not alter the Canadian border at all, but in practice, unfortunately, signaled the end of the Indians as a nation to be reckoned with. This was a bit of digression as regards Napoleon and St. Helena, but Admiral Cockburn is also the one who, during the same war of 1812, led the naval squadron up Chesapeake Bay, landed and burned the city of Washington. And this was in retaliation for the Americans having burned the town of York on Lake Ontario, which is now the present Toronto. Of partial anecdotal interest is the fact that the first building that Cockburn had delivered to the flames in Washington was the typography where the newspapers were printed. And he had a special axe to grind because the American newspapers were making fun of his last name. Anyway, still, Admiral Cockburn was in charge, as I said, of the transport of Napoleon to St. Helena, and remained as a governor of the island for a few months after Napoleon arrived. The Admiral, Napoleon, and his now the minute court of Napoleon sailed on the Northumberland, the 80-gun galleon, an 80-gun galleon and men-of-war, as well as a ship of the line, as we explained in the previous episode. Accompanying the Northumberland was a fleet of smaller ships. They left England on August 9th, 1815, and the trip lasted 2 months and 5 days. On August 15th, 6 days later, the small Napoleon's group celebrated Napoleon's birthday, and after a toast to his health in the evening, Gourgaud reports they played 21, which was a French card game, and playing chess and playing the card game was now the favorite pastime during the trip. One of the members of Napoleon's court was, again, as I mentioned before, Mr. Lascazes, who wrote a monumental 8-volume history of Napoleon at St. Helena, and he was the only one in the group that could speak English, and during the trip he also began to give English lessons to Napoleon himself. On August 31st, the fleet reached the island of Madeira, and they took on supplies, meaning fruit, wine, and water, though the Northumberland did not call at the harbour. And they did not call at the harbour not for fear that Napoleon could escape, but the crew was very mutinous, and there was fear of mass desertion by the sailors on the island of Madeira. On September 8, Napoleon asked Gourgaud to measure his height, the height of Napoleon, which was he was 5 feet and 2.5 inches tall. They were a French measure, and Gourgaud says they were a French measure, and I have not myself verified if the French inches were different from the British inches. On September 17, Gourgaud records that he and Napoleon extracted square roots and cube roots and solved equations of second and third degree. Could you imagine? And on September 19, Napoleon confided to Gourgaud that among all the actresses in Paris, Napoleon had connections with only one, a certain Mademoiselle Georges, and he concluded Napoleon, and this conclusive glimpse on his private life, and he said that the prettiest women are the hardest to make love to, at least this is what Gourgaud reports. On September 23rd at 11 o'clock in the morning, the Northumberland crossed the meridian line, the 0 line longitude, and the sailors were ready for a usual ceremony that apparently was common at the time. Gourgaud says, "We all expected that we would be soaked, as it was natural, but they were not hard on us," the sailors mean. A sailor came to ask the Admiral Cockburn, who was on the stern of the ship, where was General Bonaparte. And the Admiral replied that the General had once already crossed the line, and therefore he could have been exempted from the traditional soaking. Now two sailors came forward, one dressed as Neptune and the other dressed as Amphitrite, who was the wife of Neptune, as you see in this picture. A playing band was accompanying the party, and persons on board who had not previously crossed the line presented themselves one after the other in order to be soaked ceremonially. Gourgaud gave the sailors one Napoleon coin each and he was not drenched. He was spared the drenching. Napoleon sent for Gourgaud to find out how things were going and told him to give the sailor who was actually impersonating the god Neptune, to give him 100 Napoleons. Now Gourgaud went to ask one other character for the money to give to the sailors, but the other person said, well, this is too much. There was some hesitation about how much to give to the sailors, and Admiral Cockburn intervened and said that if Neptune received 5 Napoleons, it would be quite enough. But in the meantime, too much time had elapsed, and Neptune ended up empty-handed. During the trip, even among the small entourage around Napoleon, there were debates, arguments, and disagreements, mostly around the interpretations of events in Napoleon's career. Gourgaud notes in his diary, "Poor Gourgaud, poor me, I see many intrigues and deceptions around me. What am I going to do? What am I going to do in this prison?" On October 15, 1815, finally Northumberland sighted the island of St. Helena, and Napoleon's first words were, "It seems no charming place to me to live in. I should have done better to stay in Egypt. I should have become emperor of the whole Orient." As you know, Napoleon had a campaign in Egypt. 2 days later, after the landing, Napoleon said, according to Gourgaud, "It is a horrible island besides being a prison. You must, all of you must compete bitterly." And they all complained in the letters, except General Gourgaud, and in the letters that he wrote to his mother in Europe to reassure her and also to console her. He was the only son. These letters passed through the hands of the censorship of the governor of the island by the name of Hudson Lowe, the letters of Gourgaud were also read by the colonial secretary in the cabinet of Prime Minister, who at the time was Castlereagh, and in time these letters helped to facilitate a scheme that Napoleon had in mind to leave the island. But this scheme never materialized. Throughout the 6 years during which Napoleon stayed in St. Helena, this Governor Lowe was obsessed by the fear that Napoleon would escape. He even believed that a fleet of enemy ships would reach the remote island of Tristan da Cunha, which is 1,000 miles to the south, and from there sailed north to St. Helena to free Napoleon. Napoleon's doctor in the island had been selected by Napoleon's mother herself. He was Italian, and his name was Dr. Anton Marchi. He had studied and graduated in Pisa in Italy and also in Florence, studying in Florence. Napoleon had refused the doctors that the governor of the island, as I said, Hudson Lowe, had assigned to him. Now, Dr. Anton Marchi was present at Napoleon's death in 1821, and it was he who diagnosed that Napoleon died of stomach cancer. Gourgaud lived for 3 years in St. Helena, as I mentioned before, and then left in 1818 with the specific purpose of eliciting the consent of the European powers for Napoleon to leave St. Helena. But, as we know, he did not. This trip, the objective was not reached. He did not succeed. And here is a view of the capital of St. Helena, Jamestown, where there is even one street, naturally so, named after Napoleon, Napoleon Street. Now, for 19 years, Napoleon's remains were buried in his tomb adjacent to the Longwood House, as the compound was known at the time. But then, 19 years later, in 1840, Gourgaud and others returned to St. Helena aboard the frigate called La Belle Poule to recover the coffin and bring the remains of Napoleon back to Paris. La Belle Poule in French means the pretty hen, and this name has a story too. In 1533, the French king Francis I was visiting the city of Toulouse when a pretty girl of 15 was introduced to him. Her name was Paul de Viguier, and who was also Baroness of Fontainebleau. Now, she was apparently a real beauty, and Francis I exclaimed, "Oh, la belle Paul," which means, "Oh, the beautiful Paula." But in the French dialect, in the Occitan area, which is a version of the French language, the name is pronounced Poule, and so the exclamation of King Francis I became famous for that reason. Following the king's visit to Toulouse, a pirate, not too good at spelling, gave his ship the misspelled name Belle Poule, lovely hen, lovely chicken. And this inaugurated a series of ships, of men of war, now if you can call them, all called the Belle Poule, and this lasted until the 19th century. The most famous ship of this name is, of course, the Belle Poule, and was assigned to bring back, as I said, to France one of her most glorious sons. Napoleon's tomb is now in Paris, in the chapel inside the Hôtel des Invalides, a famous church built during the reign of Louis, the Roi Soleil, the Sun King. And so this was the third and the last historical sketch covering the flight of Napoleon, which began in Waterloo in June 15 and ended in St. Helena in October of the same year. In the first episode, we followed Napoleon from Waterloo to Paris. In the second, we followed from Paris to the French coast. And this, as I said, is the concluding episode. I will thank the crew and the director in particular, Kat Iverson. And thank you for watching. This is Jimmy from Historical Sketches. Thank you and good night.